Hola, buenos días. Good morning,
Buenos días.
everyone. My name is Veronica Vélez. Most folks on campus just know me as Vero. I have, oh my goodness, I think I just was thinking about that I'm past the 10-year mark. I've been here 11 years at Western Washington University, so it's been a little minute. I know. I feel like yes, let's applaud for the 10-year mark. No, but I've just really fortunate to be here with you all this morning. So a little bit about what we decided to do that was a little bit different. I think we were having some conversations, particularly about community, and I just want to kind of note that the folks up here, all of us work in Woodring, and we were talking really kind of intimately about like how do we think about community and about also the event that was happening today. And for us, we couldn't have a conversation about community without community. And for us, I think it was really important that you get to hear from several of us about the work we've been doing collectively and in the college to build out these conversations, but also to wrestle with the complexity and messiness of what it means to do and be in community, right? And I'll talk a little bit as we get started here about what community as verb and why we kind of went with that framework. I think to mirror a lot what Dr. Hughes was talking about this morning was this notion of process. Like community isn't just a container. It's something that has to be nurtured. It's oftentimes messy, it's contradictory. And it is something we have to think about it in not as an outcome, but as something that is always being built. It's always in process. But to kind of get us started, I did want to share that one of the things in our conversation a little bit was thinking deeply about, let's see if I can get this to work. Yeah, there we go. Was thinking about, well, as we build community, what are some of the protocols and ways that we want to do that? And I want to share a little bit, before I introduce our panel, is to talk a little bit about the notion of Chicana Latina Pláticas that comes out of Chicana feminist frameworks. I know for many of us that do this work, we do a lot of work with Chicana feminisms. And for us, we wanted to think about what are some of the ways that we have conversations, the ways that we build community in ways that feel important to us. So we're using a Chicana Latina Plática framework to engage with you this morning. And I'm going to share just a little bit about what that means and what it means for us to do Plática work. And I realized that my printer didn't quite work this morning. So I'm going to look at the screen as I talk to you all. But really thinking about, for us, Chicana Latina Pláticas is how do we center our ways of being and knowing in the ways we have conversations, in the ways that we connect, in the ways that we build. So for us, really thinking about, in particular, how do we center Black, Indigenous, and folks of color at the center of the ways that we have, organic, everyday connections, and we build with one another. And so Pláticas comes from that. I think about the ways that we have Pláticas at home, right? They just sort of happen organically. They often are about sharing an important information or important lesson. So I think about a lot of the ways that Pláticas just would kind of happen. We would kind of sit, it would kind of be like tea time, or we would have moments to break bread with each other. And we would have these Pláticas, right? And I think there are ways that feel comfortable for us in the ways that we build community. So wanted to share just a little bit with you all. Just this last quote, I'm happy to share more resources about what Chicana Latina Pláticas are, but this last quote I think for me really captures it, right? This idea that it's a collaborative process comprised of sharing stories, building community, and acknowledging multiple realities and vulnerabilities, right? And so we're gonna use that to kind of help us think through the conversation we'll have today. But before we do that, I wanna introduce my esteemed panelists, colleagues and friends that are up here. So I'm gonna read their bios because I think it's important to acknowledge just both the range and depth of their expertise, and I think what we'll be able to offer based on our own positionality and history and the work of building community. So the first, let's see if I can get this to work, is Daisy Padilla, who's our Director of Access and Inclusion in Woodring College. So Daisy earned her bachelor's in Spanish and teaching English as a second language and a master's degree in adult and higher education from Western Washington University. Her work centers on building equity and justice to enhance the educational success of first-generation students and students of color. Daisy identifies as a first-generation bilingual, bicultural Latina who grew up with farm-working parents that ingrained hard work, commitment, family, and love into her upbringing. Her family lacked many of the resources and opportunities afforded to those with more privileged backgrounds, but that did not stop them from meeting their goals. These experiences have deeply influenced her pursuit of higher education and her advocacy for diverse communities. So welcome, Daisy. Yes, can we give her applause? My esteemed colleague and chair, since I'm also in secondary education, Dr. Longoria, is Associate Professor and Chair of Secondary Education in Woodring College of Education. They are a strong proponent of multicultural education, identity-sustaining pedagogy, and bridging the divide between methods and foundation in teacher education. Longoria is co-author with Francisco Rios of the popular book, Creating a Home in Schools, Sustaining Identities for Black, Indigenous, and Teachers of Color. A former high school teacher, they formerly served as academic program director for the Masters in Teaching program. Additionally, they previously served as co-chair of the American Education Research Association Queer Studies Special Interest Group. Alongside the two of us, Longoria has co-supported the development of ethnic studies curriculum with a collective of educators for Bellingham Public Schools. They have taught courses for family and community engaged teaching and for the education and social justice minor. Longoria currently serves as director for the Center of Education, Equity, and Diversity. Originally from El Centro, California, Longoria is Chicanec's grandchild of immigrants from the Pearl River Delta in China and the state of Zacatecas in Mexico. Outside of academia, Longoria enjoys fiber crafting, especially knitting, bel canto, opera, and cooking. So welcome, Dr. Longoria. And of course, my wonderful colleague we share the Associate Dean title in Woodring, Dr. John Korsmo, who's the Associate Dean for Student Access, Success, and Outreach for Woodring College. And he's also a professor of Human Services in the Health and Community Studies Department. Dr. Korsmo is an applied scholar whose work has been instrumental in supporting the development of the field of youth work and supporting community development efforts regionally and nationally. His scholarly and teaching interests are situated within family culture and well-being in the context of culturally sustaining and honoring pedagogy. His work is particularly related to youth and family efforts to deal with and depart from cycles of poverty and violence. Included here is attention to college access and attainment for low-income and first-generation college goers. Having worked in numerous capacities in under-resourced neighborhoods in Oregon, Wisconsin, and Washington, John's related experiences range from primary school PE teacher, high school coach, counselor, and youth worker to executive director of 2 organizations, consultant, professor, and so much more. So these are some of the many, both non-academic but also important academic roles that he holds and that he brings to his work every day in his work with our colleagues and with us in Woodring College. So welcome, Dr. Korsmo. I think it's a little weird to read my own bio, but I'm just Vero. I'll just be really quick. I'm also the Associate Dean for Woodring College for Academic Affairs and Professor in Secondary Education. I'll probably share more of some of my own interests and background as we have conversations. I believe it ties in really deeply to what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so we're going to get started with our first question. All right. So, our first question, how do each of us define community, given our own positionality and areas of work? And this is something that I think also Dr. Hughes opened up with this morning. How do we define community? So, I'm actually going to turn over to you, Longoria, to kind of get us started, if that's okay. And then we'll just kind of, engage and move through each of us to talk a little bit about what that means for us.
Yeah, I'm also living for this live translation. Just very, very appropriate. So this question is beautifully complicated, and I'm also mindful of the remarks that Dr. Hughes was making this morning. We good with the mic?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to give a shout out to plurality. And I think that when we're thinking of community, especially in 2024, I think it's important to remember that there are many of us, and that plurality means, and Dr. Hughes talked about that we're not all going to get along, that there is tension. And I think normalizing that pushback is important. I'm mindful that when we are truly honoring plurality, that we are expecting that there will be work being done within our homes, within our like community groups, that it's not that we have to somehow create some kind of utopian community where we are all getting along and frolicking and holding hands at all moments. I think it's important to have, as some scholars refer to, backstage spaces where we do have our like groups, and for the survival of our differences as well as that which unites us. And so in many ways, I hope that as we continue to build whatever it means to have community, that it really does include many communities, and that we continue to wrestle with that. I'd be remiss to not, invoke my own identities and the ways that my own social locations emerge as a Chinese Mexican Capricorn and as a non-binary person. And the last thing I want to say, just to get on the very local level, is I have found community here at Western, and it is imperfect and it is siloed, but I would also be remiss to not mention that Western is a place where I have found employment and where I have the ability to be known by my name and to be able to be out as authentically as I am. And I think that that's also important, that there is a kind of beauty amidst the rubble that we're trying to rebuild into a larger community. So that's what I'm being mindful of.
Yeah. I think what's so powerful about what you're sharing is this notion of plurality. Because I think it reminds me so much of the organizing work I used to do with mothers, what they would always say, like, donde quepan muchos mundos dentro de un mundo, right? It's a Mayan sort of proverb. Donde many worlds can fit within one world, right? And I think it's something that reminds us that's so powerful. And I'm thinking about your work, Daisy, right? Because, you operate in so many communities, both here, locally within the context of Western, but you're also situated in some of the beautiful communities in Skagit that you've bridged, right? And so I feel like you do such beautiful work in bridging community, and I'm curious for you, based on both your experience and also your own identities, like, how do you see or define community?
Yeah, I think just first of all, it's a privilege to be up here with these scholars. And when you all invited me to be a part of this, I was just like, why? But the more we talk about this topic, and as we were brainstorming and dialogue and having pláticas about what plática we were gonna have, we could have gone in so many different directions with this topic of community and how do we define it. And I think, like Vero was mentioning, a lot of the work that I do is with school district partners, communities, students, and colleagues across not only Western and Woodring, but just across every aspect. And I think Dr. Longoria's book, along with Dr. Rio's book, where they talk about identity and how those things have an impact not only within the classroom, but I think as we develop as professionals and how do we bring our own identities into the work. I think all of this is very powerful and it all aligns and it's very intersectional. And so when I think about communities with the work that we're doing, and within my positionality, I think about, which is here, is the belonging of students, right? So how do students and community feel like they belong in a space like this? And a space like this, meaning a four-year institution that is built not necessarily for the students that we work with. I think that in order for students to feel like they belong, they need to feel trust within the people that they are connecting with. And in order for that to happen, they need to be building community. And so I love what you said about how you found community here at Western. And I think we talk a lot about that, right? Like our we have a home away from home, and we have our chosen family, which I have learned from my chosen family here at Western. And so being able to develop trust within chosen family, people who we trust and are building community across districts, across state lines potentially, across institutions, across programs within our programs, but I think also across the programs and colleagues across Western, like the MCC folks, like our ESJ folks, like our SEED folks, like our Western admission folks. I think it helps build that sense of belonging, that sense of community across what we are all here essentially doing, and that's to meet the students' needs of getting a higher education. And so when I think about my work and my positionality and my experience, that's what I think about. I think about trust, I think about family, I think about how we are building community and how we are communicating across those different spheres, I guess.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And I mean, I've seen Daisy work in such beautiful spaces, so I can attest to the way that she's able to bring her whole self into those community spaces, make connections in ways that are deeply profound. And to see students always come back and reach out to Daisy because of the connection she makes. And I think community really comes down to relationships, right? And the ways that we cultivate and care for those relationships. And I'm thinking about you, John, because I've gotten to know John really well this year as part of our role in the Associate Dean's Office. And I've got to hear so many stories of when you were an organizer and connecting. And I think it's really powerful to see those elements of you as an organizer because we share that background and how it makes its way into the everyday work you do in the college. And I think we're well positioned in Woodring to have these conversations as well, just because we're constantly interfacing with communities both on and off campus. But yeah, I'm just curious for you, John, what does that mean for you to think about community?
Buddy, for being here. You know, just to add to what's been said, I would circle back to the title of the talk about community as a verb, and I would say as an action verb, and connect that even more specifically to the choice, to the intentional choice of trying to use a process of Platica sort of methodology or experience, which is also an action verb, and it's a part of how we engage in building community. So for me, it's a variety of things. It's beyond membership of sort of a shared spatial and causal sort of place. We're colleagues. But so what? We're all at Western Washington University today, and so what? Are we in community together, each of you in this room and those people who might be online, and I in community together? I'd say no, unfortunately, we're not. Without some action together and some opportunity for us to engage. And so I think part of what I am really committed to and appreciative of are those opportunities for literal dialogue, relational opportunities to get to know one another. The notion of the sense of belonging has been referenced a few times. So this sense of like shared desire to be together in space, in community, and a sense of belonging. I belong with Longoria. Longoria belongs with me in this joint activity that we take on together, whether that's a conversation or that's writing a grant or that's sitting down with a student to support a student or whatever it is. And I also think about it in terms of the context of why all of us are here, whether we're here as students or listening as students or as faculty, as administrators, as volunteers, whatever our positionalities are, does matter. And so being able to be cognizant of that and the reality of power imbalance in such an institution as Western or any higher education institution. And so thinking about that, that need for self-awareness and the capacity to be able to lean into not just labor together, but have fun together. I mean, the big part of community development, in my opinion, is not just about tackling all of the ills of a particular situation or coming at it from a deficit orientation, which also often happens. Oh, it's a community that's experiencing poverty, or it's an organization that's experiencing strife, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That list is long, but it's also a community experiencing love and hope and joy and laughter and fun and vibrancy, as is Western Washington University and the various communities that we have the opportunity to share. So I think we'll want to be more engaged and build community and relationships if we actually like being there. It's not always a heavy lift.
Yeah. Go ahead, jump in.
You said, Daisy, you referred to us as scholars, but you're a scholar too. You embody scholarship through your work, and I think that really points to the important work that staff do. I think about the work that Amy Westmoreland and Nia Gibson do. I think about the work that our staff do in Woodring, in my own department. There is embodied scholarship that that we work alongside staff, and I think that Jacqueline talked about a paradigm shift. I think that's another paradigm shift that needs to happen as well, and that is also something in our community that I think we can have more, not just dialogue, but in trying to honestly remake how we do that and see that work as embodied scholarship, that the work you do is also your intellectual property, and that that also needs to be honored and recognized and respected in the same ways that our publishing and our teaching do, which you also happen to have done too, but speaking specifically to the daily work of staff, I think is also part of our community. And then the other tiny little point I want to make is I think Woodring is a wonderful example of that pluralistic mess, beautiful mess, chaos, but beautiful chaos that is our community. I think it's important that we're not just a teacher's college. That is important work that we do. We harken back to the founding of Western and many schools that began as a normal school, and we do that important work from our charge from the state to educate its teachers. But we are also the home of a nursing or several nursing programs. We're the home of health and community studies. We're the home of the education and social justice minor. We're the home for the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity, the Urshig Center. We have so many different elements in Woodring that are also engaged in deep community work that go beyond teacher education. And so I also hope that by naming that and perhaps by introducing that to some folks that might not know that we can help those in our larger community understand the deeper work that Woodring is engaged in.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think as we transition into our next question in a second, I definitely want us to talk about Facet, which I think was another model of beautiful work that the three of us were involved in, particularly in Daisy, you were also connected because a lot of those students ended up becoming future Woodring scholars. So these connections are oftentimes they're so present in the work we do, and how do we continue to nurture, even if we can't always be in community all at the same time. We know community is constantly sort of existing and supporting and nurturing these projects. What I'll share is a couple of things just really quick for me, because the first thing I think about when I think about community, I think about my mom. And I think about when I go home, right, there are no titles. There is no doctora anything. I'm just Vero, right? And I go home, she's very quick to remind me, when I'm home, being bien educada, being well educated has nothing to do with degrees. It has nothing to do with how long I've been in school. It's about how we greet one another. It's about how we say goodbye. And sometimes that goodbye can take us an hour. You know what I mean? When you have family over, I don't know if some of you can relate, right? You got family over and it's you're trying to say goodbye and you're inching closer to the door than the car, right? It's the hour-long goodbyes. So that moment, but that is for me what it means being bien educada. It means that we leave the comalan, which is where we heat tortillas, even though we don't know who needs it. Because you always have to be ready to make sure you have that tortilla that's warm for the person that needs it, right? Those are the kinds of skills that I grew up with about what it means to be in community, what it means to take care of one another, what it means to be present, right? That in those moments, there aren't anything about titles or who's better at this. It's like we all have a particular role we play, but there's something about the ways I go home. My mom likes to check me real quick, right? When I'm trying to zoom into meetings, and she's like, I'm gonna have like, El Gordo y la Flaca on at 3 o'clock, so I don't care what you're doing, but we're gonna have the show going on. And it's just because in that space, there's a different priority. In that space, there's a different commitment to the folks in that space, right? So I share that because there are protocols to community. There are ways in which when we enter a space, how do we become familiar with those protocols? And how do we, when it's not communities that we come from, how do we honor those protocols? How do we make space for those protocols? And I think that's something for me that I had to learn. And then, taking that into my very early, and I was a grassroots organizer for about 15 years. And I remember my very first organizing job and having this moment where I thought to myself, I'm gonna do everything I was trained to do in my program, and I'm gonna make all the flyers, and I'm gonna get all the pan dulce and the champurrado, and they're going to come. Community is gonna come to me, right? I remember literally having that idea, right? And I worked so hard for that first meeting, and like one mother showed up. And I was, it was basically my role was to do parent involvement and leadership work. One mother showed up. I'll never forget Magdalena. She sat with me and she's like, look, I know you're 21 and you're really excited to be all about that justice life and you want to get going, but you don't even know us. You don't know what we've been through in this space. You don't know what this school has done to us. So before you think you're going to bring some pan dulce and make some flyers and offer childcare, you should have checked all the dots. You first have to figure out, you need to get to spend time talking to us. Find out where we're at, right? And so it was a reminder to me, right? Community isn't going to come to you, right? It's something about the ways in which we take time to listen. And so I remember, I'm not a morning person, but I got up really early. After that, Magdalena schooled me, and I was at the school at like 6:30, because that's when the family started to show up. And I would bring coffee. And I'll never forget this moment where as I was talking to the mothers in that space, started to notice some things about the school. I noticed the police car right in front of the school. Started to notice how the school was completely gated and there was barbed wire around the fencing. Started to notice like the young children peering through the fence, but they couldn't get to the playground that was on the other side. And I began to say to myself, wow, like, this is definitely a space where if I were a parent here, I would not feel welcomed. I would not feel like I belong, right? And after about 6 months of doing that, spending time every morning, having coffee, getting to know them, one of the moms said to me, she's like, what are you doing after the bell rings? And I'm like, well, I'm gonna make myself useful in the school, see what teacher needs some support. And she said, I wanna invite you to my home. And I said, okay. So she invited me to her home, was about 3 blocks away from the school. And the moment I walked into her home, there was about 60 parents in her home. And she said to me, just because community isn't organizing at the school doesn't mean that there isn't community. She said, we've been organizing here for years. So once I found out, right, and I was invited into the space and took time to listen and took time to learn and to grow with them, all I had to do was call one mom, and I would have 300 parents in a room for a meeting. Because it was rested on the relationships and reciprocity, but there was trust, but it took time. But I never forget that, right? Sometimes where you think community is not where community is. But how do we find those things? How do we build the conditions for which to do that? So for me, those are the things that I remember so deeply, and I wanted to share that story with you as kind of we open. But as we transition to the next question, we talked a little bit, and I think some of you got into a little bit of this. We talked about defining community. But the next question really is, how do we build, right? What does it mean to build community, especially with individuals who hold different identities than our own? So I'm gonna open up the space. Who wants to start this? Daisy, do you want to jump in?
I mean, I can. I think that these might be very simple questions, but they're so complex that in various different levels, we can probably take this conversation in many different directions too. How do we build community? I think your story is very prevalent, right? I think especially in the ways that we build community. My background, I think, I can relate to a lot of the things that you were sharing, and therefore I can see and I can relate to a lot of the students that we work with, because we share similar identities and or experiences. And I think through those shared experiences and identities, we're able to build that trust. And we're able to understand where students are coming from. We're able to understand potentially their needs, and or we're able to empathize and have compassion for what they are seeing and experiencing and or what their needs are. And so I guess for me, how I tend to build community is that if you know me, you know that I live and I get powered through relationships. Relationships are really important for me. And so I guess the priority for me is to make sure that I am in relation and or in community with folks prior to asking them for something and or asking them to trust me and come to and join our programs or join our teacher education programs, for example. But having a cafecito, right? Having that time to get up from our office and our caves and make the walk, and just introduce ourselves to people, have lunch with people and get to know each other on how do you navigate this, right? How have you worked with students in the past? If I'm thinking specifically about our work here at Western and in Woodring, and across districts and communities. And so I guess for me, how I build community is really putting myself out there in a way that we have a real relationship, and that people really get to know my intentions, my foundation, my priorities, and what drives the work that I do and why I do the work that I do. I think especially with students, because again, I think that if students cannot see themselves collaborating, contacting you, being in space and shared community with you, it's really challenging for them to come to you for help, which is essentially where we meet them halfway, right? And I think something that you said, Longoria, earlier of how sometimes it's challenging, right? But I think that it's challenging because, at least with the work that we do with students or other communities, it's because they've been harmed in the past. And so for us to be able to understand what that means and what that is, and working through the process of how do we not only band-aid the harm, but really dig deep to understand what has happened and how do we repair and restore that trust with people. In my mind, it's students and families. So that's how I've built community in the past, especially within higher education and especially within spaces like these.
Sorry, I had the wrong question up there.
Oh, it's okay.
That's the last question we'll talk about in a second.
Sorry. And then I think building communities, with folks who have different identities from mine. Essentially, I think being very mindful that I will never be in their shoes. I can empathize, I can be compassionate and understand, but acknowledging that I can never be in somebody else's shoes, and again, understand and being able to meet them where they need me to meet them and be invited into that space. Foundationally, again, I don't think that I would be able to do the work that I do if it wasn't for me learning how to navigate and process all of these things, but also knowing that it's okay to bring my authentic self to the table and bring my full self to the work that I do. And I think through those human to human conversations, real, honest, and genuine conversations, I think is what has helped me do the work that I do.
I think about building community and some early work that we did with Facet, which was a program that we had in Woodring called Family and Community Engaged Teaching. And in that, we had a partnership with the Be at Shuckson or BEATS program at Shuckson Middle School. And this was before the pandemic. But I remember Vero and I had a meeting with the key players for that program. And Vero and I started the meeting with, so what do you need? What are your needs? And they were like shocked. Because, and they told us later that they were used to the university coming in and saying, here's what we need, here's what you have to do, and do it. And so they were shocked with us beginning that meeting with listening to their needs. And then as Vero and I, we're like, this is how we do it. And so our job, we thought, was to hear those needs and figure out how to have a class in that space. And so what it ended up being was they needed bodies. They needed people to work directly with youth. And we're like, cool, that's exactly what we want our students to have experience with. And then they were like, well, why don't you volunteer too? And so Vero and I got to volunteer in the after-school program as part of our class, as co-instructors, but got to do service alongside our students directly with youth, and then have our class right afterward. And that just evolved into we would start the day with a class, go to service, and then have dinner, because it's the site of the federal dinner program in Birchwood. And then we would reflect with our students on the service day. And what was so beautiful is in building that community, the staff would join us, and then the youth would join us. And also check our students, to the tune of, no, it didn't happen that way. Or the youth would have input on the ways that Vero and I were bringing the students' experiences back to the theories that we were engaging with. So it's that, I think, orientation toward building within and in our communities, or adding community members is, and it seems so simple. It is more difficult, I think, to enact, but to start with listening to needs. And then on that, I think, and maybe this is getting too much into challenges, but I do think something that I think is important to name too is we can have these beautiful theories and ideas about how to engage in community, but I think we also need to acknowledge the historical harm and the historical trauma, and that in this moment, community isn't going to be for everyone. And I don't say that to impede building community, but I think it's also a kind of respectful community engagement to understand that now is not the moment, and to not pathologize when folks are not in the space to be part of the community, and they might not ever be. Vero, you learning protocols, that might just be part of the community, and I think that's still something to keep wrestling with and have tension with, and perhaps that's also just learning the history, learning the context. You talked about learning the layout of the school, and I'm also mindful of that in this panel, just thinking about the history, we have a full professor, we have a tenured professor, we have a director of ADI, and John Hay, and glad you're here. But if I'm thinking historically, we're not supposed to be here. I don't usually like that term, but I think it's important to name. There are 3 of us up here that, by design, we're not supposed to be part of this community. I'm pretty sure in those normal school days, we were not part of the design. We were not being thought of. And I'm almost certain not long after that, we still wouldn't have been at this cute table. And that's a historical context that I think we need to continue to wrestle with. And I don't say that to mean that our community should be one that is this orgy of apologies, or is supposed to just invite guilt. I think it's about authentically engaging with, we still have historical harm and historical exclusions, and that needs to be part of our community building process as well. And some folks need to opt out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very difficult thing, but I think that's a very real thing we need to be thinking about.
Yeah. Now I'm going to get to, what you offered, Longoria, and I'm going to get to John in a second, but this question that you can't define community and you can't build community without thinking about power. And that for me is essential in the way that we've been operating, that power is such a key part of this. And power also moves through us too, right? I mean, I remember being at that middle school trying to be cute and thinking I'm like, young, and students called me boomer, and I had a moment because I was like, they just did not want anything to do with me. And I was trying to build community. It took me a while before I got them to trust me. But I remember these things, like power is very prevalent in all these spaces, and it moves and it operates in so many different ways. So I'm curious for you, John, like what are the ways that you feel like in your trajectory, and you've been in multiple spaces as well, what are some of the things that you've learned about building community?
I'm going to build off of what Longoria was just saying, in that, I think it really requires us, myself, to speak for me, it's required me to do my work, right? And so as somebody, I am white, I'm male, I'm straight, I'm now, comfortably middle class. The majority of my working career, in particular before coming to Western, but even since being at Western, is in and with communities that didn't necessarily look like me. And so, the question is a loaded one, partially intentionally and partially because it's a big and complex question around identity. Because we could easily go to identification as race-based or ethnicity-based or class or religion or gender or sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in my opinion, the ways that we can do this when we don't feel as though many of our identities may not match the folks who we're trying to engage in community with, I believe I have to do the work, like some real work. And when I think about words such as empathy, I think back the way, I really think of empathy in part as being respectfully curious. And so a part of that respectful curiosity could maybe lead me down a path to try and learn more. So maybe as a straight white guy, for instance, engaging as a college student in, say, women's studies courses and black studies courses, engaging in things that weren't necessarily like queued up and lined up. And then keeping in mind just keeping in mind that notion of positionality, but also there are a whole lot of straight, white, middle-class men who do not want to be in community with me and who we don't share identity, other types of identities. We might share those characteristics. And so also I think that can be a real head trip for some folks, and particularly folks who are in the majority in, say, Western, who can think that, oh my gosh, everyone who is X is down together. Like they're having Sunday barbecues, and they're like, I wish I could be with that particular group, but I don't identify with that group. And unless somebody invites me into that group, I'm missing out. It's of mythical proportion. And so I think the invitation for folks that aren't, maybe we don't presume are like us, can be useful. Really listen more, talk less, humility. Institutions of higher learning are not bastions of humility. I mean, it's just not. And so trying to encourage folks to bring with them some sense of humility when dealing with folks who appear to be different is important. Try to fight the temptation to romanticize like similarities, like, oh yeah, we're so different, but we've got this thing in common, and so that's the thing that's going to connect us. That may or may not be true. We might be able to develop new commonalities for building a relationship. So I feel blessed to sort of just use that word for my abilities to be heavily engaged and warmly welcomed into various communities where I clearly on the surface would not have appeared to have shared many identity elements. whether, that's throughout my life. And so I think some of those early childhood opportunities also were points of unexpected connections to folks who maybe held some similar identities associated, say, for instance, with socioeconomic status or, poverty or violence or what have you. Some of those different things that on the surface you wouldn't necessarily see, but it's there. And then lastly, I will just say, for those of us who are trying to build community with students, I would encourage us to remember what Vero was just hinting at. For the most part, a lot of the students are staying pretty young, and we're not. And so, the idea that we can relate to or identify with college students, because I'm also 24, is only temporary. And so, trying to think about the ways in which that can play a factor. But I think it's a really important question. And if we can also have like trusting friends. And so that I can lean into Longoria or Daisy or Vero and say, Vero, I'm trying to, I would really like to be engaged in this particular space. I know that you have experience with that space. Can we sit down together and talk about it? And man, asking those questions, you can learn a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I was thinking so much about how I wanted to engage this particular question, and listening to you all, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have like so many. So I feel like we could be up here for a hot minute having a conversation about this topic, or any topic, quite frankly. But one of the things that was coming to mind, I was thinking about how you were talking about all these different identities, and I also think it's important to think about things through an intersectional lens, which I think is also, and I think one of the best lessons, and I'll tell another story. I'll tell a couple stories, and I'm going to go back to my organizing work, because I think those were the lessons for me from where I think I draw a lot of thinking about, and I bring those lessons from my organizing work directly into my work here on campus, and my work with students, and my work in this new role with Woodring. But I'll never forget this. I'll remember I had a moment, because both my parents are immigrants. My mother is from Central Mexico, and my father is from Panama. And I started organizing with migrant communities largely because I remember as a first grader having to translate for my parents, who didn't speak English, right? And being this really savvy translator and love to translate to my favor. By the way, translating kids are really smart. Oftentimes to get out of trouble, we would translate. I was never, I was a perfect child in all my classes. But I do think about how going through those experiences and watching how my teachers treated my mother with such disdain for not knowing the language, instilled in me a rage that I think translated into why I ended up going into organizing work, working with families like my own. But I'm not an immigrant, right? I was born in the US. In many ways, had a lot of privilege growing up. And I have these moments where I remember I was organizing with one of the groups there in my hometown. And I had a little bit of a crisis. I'm like, what am I doing here? Like, I don't have children in the school district. I don't know what it's like to wake up every morning and not have a social security number, right? A lot of the mothers that I were organizing with were undocumented. It's like not having a social security number organized their entire day. And it's something I never had to think about, And I have this memory of like having a bit of a crisis, like, what am I doing here? Like, how can I add value? And I really want to organize. And I'll never forget, and this goes to the point you were raising, Daisy, that I thought was so powerful. I remember she grabbed me by the shoulder. She's like, look, like, as long as you can remain teachable, we will tell you if you're overstepping, okay? So like, as long as you're good and you remain teachable, that's the humility point, we're good. And then she said something to me. She's like, it's not necessarily, and I say empathy, not in the ways that you described, John, I think are so beautiful, but empathy in the sense that a lot of this kind of like, oftentimes we do DEI work and thinking like, I just have to understand that other experience. And she said, no. She's like, you may never know what it's like to walk my shoes as an undocumented person. That does not mean that you cannot act in solidarity with me. So the question there for her was like, community does not mean that you need to know ins and outs and be a part of all the, like, there are times that you will not know. That does not mean you can't be in solidarity with me. And so this is a question that I come back to over and over. What does solidarity look like on this campus? Even and when we're not present in every space to be a part of those communities, because sometimes communities need to have their own spaces, right? And so how do we sort of navigate that and kind of work through our feelings around that, but we can still act in solidarity with them? And the other thing I'll share in terms of building community, it was another time where I had finished my organizing work in the Bay and was coming to the Bay, to my hometown, and I'll never forget this other time. I really wanted to connect to this one parent group that was doing this phenomenal work around popular education. And I went up to the lead mom and I said, hey, I'm here, I want to help, right? I came in, I want to help. And then her question to me was like, okay, so are you a baseball player? And I thought, that is a really odd question. And I didn't know how to answer it because I'm like, man, if I answer this, she's not going to let me want to help. And I really want to help. I really want to be a part of this space. And she saw me struggling because I didn't want to get the wrong answer. And I'm like, I was trying to process her question. She's like, look, I just want to know if you're going to step and run. There are a lot of folks that want to organize with us or connect with us or find us useful, but they'll only stay as long as we're useful to them. And then they leave. So let me ask you again, are you a baseball player? And I said, no, I'm not a baseball player. I'm here to stay, right? And the lesson for me that and the way it translates for me in higher education is I've seen this. I mean, I was MECHA's advisor for many years. And I remember people would want to connect with MECHA, for particular things or to get them to sign off on something or because they needed Latino students at this thing. But they had actually never spent time building with MECHA or connecting with the students or wanting to spend time thinking about what is my relationship to Latinx communities here in this region. It was only when there was an event or moment or crisis that all of a sudden these student groups come into focus. And it reminded me of Susana when she asked me, are you a baseball player? And it's something that I've always carried with me as part of my own ethic of how I build community. We're not just there to step and run, right? And so that's another thing that I constantly hold in my own ethic. So the last question, then we want to open and hear from you all. And I know we've kind of been hinting at that already, and Longoria, I don't know if you want to jump in as well and sort of talk, because I think you started us off a little bit with challenges, right? But the question here is, we talked a little bit, already about these, and we know we don't want to end necessarily on kind of but we do want to kind of name some of these challenges of building community in higher education, and particularly what insights can Woodring offer. And I think, again, we're really well situated because of the ways that we're constantly sort of thinking about community both on and off campus with our district partners, with different programs that we have off-site. So yeah, I'm curious for you, like, what are some of the challenges that you see in addition to what you've shared or building on what you've already shared around building community here on our campus?
I think in 2024, the work looks different. And so some of the resistances we've had in creating educator of color spaces and making sure that we are in line with the current interpretations of law and policy, I think that's been a shift in the work. And I know that Woodring in particular navigates that. Daisy oversees the Future Woodring Scholars Program, which identifies first-year Woodring major interested students, and there's a full year of programming, and but it also ends up becoming a very strong space for future educators of color. And I know that this team, along with our Woodring Dean, helped secure scholarship funding for, in particular, educators of color, and for our Maestros para el Pueblo program, which is a partnership with the Skagit Valley community. I think that in addition to those challenges, I think if I could, I'm gonna stray away from that. Because I think, like, how do we keep doing this work? Because I think it's fair to say we're all committed to building justice-oriented spaces at Western. And I guess I'm really speaking to the folks that are already doing this work deeply. Daisy, if I could share this publicly. Daisy and I, at least once a quarter, will talk about how, let's just go work at a bank. Let's, and I think right now in the fantasy, it's already like first, sometimes it's Fred Meyer, but like sometimes it's like first Latinx bank of Skagit. Like, and I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, that this is difficult work. And I think that, being engaged, and I don't think we do it perfectly, but I think having a commitment to do this work also means that you're going to be wrestling with not having capacity to do this work and not wanting to do this work. It's not that I get up every day and like, I want to have resistance. I want people to not be down with what I do or what I believe in. And I think it's really that I think needs to be part of the conversation too, is not only inviting people to this work, but inviting realistically that there will be pushback, there will be resistance, and that it's okay to go to your community and be like, what would it be like if I just went and worked at a bank or a front? And I don't mean to belittle those professions. It's just to not, to have some kind of respite. And I think that that's a challenge that we haven't really figured out, even in navigating boundaries. And it's just, it's for those of you particularly that are doing this deeper work. I think of Elaine Mahari, our beautiful co-director of Education and Social Justice minor. We've had deep conversations about how to sustain this work. And I think that's the challenge that I'm still wrestling with, even with like my boundaries that I put in place to try to keep doing this work as long as my healthy body can, for what that's worth.
So I'll go. I'm thinking about two different situations and two different examples. Kevin, I'm not gonna go work at a bank. I will stay here. But I think that a couple things that come to mind for me, especially in the context of higher education, and especially in the context of Western and Woodring, I think that when we are attempting to build community across different communities, and especially across communities that potentially don't look like us, I'll speak within my positionality. I think that too often the university is putting us against each other. And so we have spaces, we have environments like our 150 suite, like the MCC. And I think too often we are put in these situations where we have to, for example, and maybe these are not the proper words, but we have to fight for the resources, right? So the university has to make a decision on in which direction do these resources go to and how. And 80%, 90% of the time, it's our programs, the programs that are doing the deep investment and commitment and working through these challenges and the protocols and the processes of how do we build real community within spaces like higher education. The same institutions that give me a job and give me a career and that pay my bills and sustain my children's livelihood. And at the same time, how do we bring that authentic self to the table and have meaningful conversations and practices in spaces like this when we know that those things are kind of a cloud over us, right? And I think that that's part of the challenges that I don't think we talk about too often. Because we want to support each other, because we are community, right? And then I think that the other challenging part that I've seen that makes it challenging to build community is it's easier said than done. Earlier I mentioned getting out of our caves and making the walk, right? But being very intentional with time of how many times do we come to the MCC, right? My colleague Mia Martinez joined our work recently, and being very intentional about the work that we do, how we do it, and where do we do it. And in order to do that, we need to leave our space. We need to get up and move around our campus. And I think she can attest to how challenging that is at times, right? Because our students need us in the places that they feel welcome. And at the same time, we also have to build across our colleagues with Nia and Amy, where we know that the students here also need us, and we have to be present for them and build that trusting relationship with them. Otherwise, they won't come to us. And so how do we do that in a sustainable way? I think we're still working through those things. And definitely time is always of essence of we never have enough time to do everything that we wish we could do. But I think those are some of the things that I can speak about related to the work that we do and also being in Woodring.
You know, just given the context that I guess the biggest challenge is that we need to do this work in the first place, and we're not just doing it because we would like to and it would feel good, but the fact that we have to do it because it's necessary, because of the historical wrongs and the current wrongs is a challenge. But we living with that challenge, understanding that we all have that challenge. If I diagnose, like for me, honestly, and I can speak to Woodring, I'm at Woodring, but I would project this is probably true across campus. I think one of the key challenges is, I guess I could say, insufficient trust in one another. And I think it comes down to that individual level, to be honest, in many cases. And so as we're talking about building community and building relationship and having a plática, having opportunities to talk and commune together and be together and think together, can support the nurturing and building of some trust. But I really believe, honestly, that there's a need for increased trust within Woodring and within all of Western. And so I think we need to be able to trust each of the various departments and colleges and offices and one another. And by that I mean, I don't know, I think one of the challenges is that how much energy and resources it takes for us, and why I think in part we've been spinning for some of us it feels like really slow progress, feels like we're spinning our wheels sometimes. I really believe that a lot of that is due to that sense of I don't really 100% low-key trust this person or that department or that program or that office or that position, even if it's not a particular human being. But I don't trust the president. I don't trust the dean. Speaking for my own experiences, I really do believe that's an honest, candid, and accurate sort of response of that if we can build more trust, and I do think we can, I think it's going to be a lot of things are going to happen positively. And I'll go back to something I said previously as in terms of a challenge, and then I'll be done. But it's about that, the engaging in community, and especially community that with intentions of working towards justice and justness, does require humility, not just cultural humility, but literal humility and an absolute respect for the others. And that kind of thing isn't what we're taught to do at an institution. These types of institutions are competitive by nature. There's this hierarchy that's been developed, the roles, the power imbalance that you were speaking to, Longoria, the fact that I want to be the smartest person in the room at all times and at all expense. I want to be seen as a professor and not a staff, or I want to be tenured and not non-tenured track, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on and on. And then that, combined with that lack of trust, creates a really difficult challenge, because I feel like, oh, the only way I can succeed in this higher ed sort of scenario is to be the smartest in the room. So therefore, I have to sort of operate as such, and they do this performative dance. And it takes away from the authenticity that Daisy keeps talking about. And the authenticity is what is like the attractor. So when I think you're a fraud or you're not authentic, it sort of tells me, you know what, I was right in the first place. I shouldn't trust that person. So it's a cycle that can be perpetuated. So I think we need to break those sort of cycles of fulfilling our prophecies of each other not being trustworthy. And I don't mean to be so negative, but I'm being honest. And so I think the more we can trust each other, the more we can be together and want to be together and do the work.
And I'll just end with just a couple of comments, and then hopefully we'll take a couple of questions from you all as well. But I'll simply share this. I think that I can't think of community or community building without a deep commitment to justice. Like, I don't exist in communities or with communities without a commitment to envision a better world. Whether that be home, when I talk to my mom and she's, talking about what her visions are for the world, or the communities we built here with students, or the organizing work I did with mothers. So for me, like, I get nervous when I hear or think about community being disconnected or divorced from a political process, right? So for me, those things are deeply intertwined. In fact, can't be disarticulated. And so the thing for me that also becomes really challenging then, if I think about it as so deeply connected to justice, I think in higher ed, we all have very different, I feel like how we understand justice is there's a wide range of how people define what that is, right? And so for me, I think being very clear about people's, like, your theory of change, like if you're thinking about your work in community, how are we defining what is the for what and for whom of this work? How are we defining the terms of justice in this project? And I say this pretty explicitly because as I'm someone I was that student activist on campus as an undergrad. I was the one, if I were thinking about myself right now, I would be in the encampments in support of Gaza. I am in support of what's happening, right, in solidarity with those movements. And if I think about that, I would be remiss not to mention or to talk about that the complexities of what's happening, right, where students are protesting. People can have all kinds of ideas of, like, yeah, it's messy, it's complicated, in the sense of, we can think about all the ways that but the university repression on those student activists speaks to something much deeper. We say we want, like, I think about our campus, we say we want active minds changing lives, but how is that actually visible to our students in the ways that we provide space to build those things, right? And so I keep coming back to, like, for me, in the context of what's happening right now, how are we building the solidarity with movements, with communities who are actively working for a better world? And I think that's where it gets really complicated in higher education, right? Because we immediately go to this kind of like place of like policies and laws and procedure, and then we forget that so much of how community is built, does not rest in policy and law and procedure. It rests on the things it rests on love, on commitments, on shared struggle. And I think oftentimes this can collide with how universities tend to operate. And so for me, I'm always thinking, what is our theory of change? If we say we want justice, how are we actually making that visible? And for me, I always think, and I'll end with this, I think a lot about James Baldwin. At least I think about his work, and I use it a lot in my own work. And he has this powerful, and if you can find it, it's on YouTube, and he has this conversation with a Yale professor. And in that conversation, the Yale professor's like, I don't understand why we constantly have to be like, race is this thing that divides us. Maybe what connects us is that we're both like men, or we both have a commitment, we're both scholars. And James Baldwin's response was pretty powerful. And he says to this Yale professor, he's like, I don't know if you like me, but I know the books you assign to my children in public schools. I don't know if you really care about Black people, but I know, like, what happens, I think the most segregated hour is high noon on Sunday, right? Talk about a Christian nation, how do I define that? You say you want to be about me, but our actions show completely different. So I think it goes back to this, if we're going to engage in these challenges, we can't just be about rhetoric, we can't just state commitments. We have to follow through the ways that we act in our spaces. And that means engaging with some pretty messy politics when it comes to community building. And I think people get nervous. There's moments where like we don't know how to lean in or lean back or, but that is what we have to reckon with. The contradictions of higher education and the ways it can impede community building in very real ways, as kind of what's been shared on the panel. So I wanted to kind of offer that as sort of just insights and knowing, as somebody who's now, I find myself very, it's a little bit of a weird year because I think I never thought in a million years, being both first generation and a child of immigrants, that I would find myself as an associate dean of anything, or professor, quite frankly. And I think oftentimes that, as these different, spaces become diversified in different ways in terms of leadership, I have to constantly remind myself that white supremacy can exist in a room with no white people in it. The same way patriarchy can exist in a room with no men in it. It is built into the fabric of how we do things. And if I'm not careful, it becomes really easy to become complicit, even as a woman of color. And I'm going to name that really kind of openly, right? So I think we need very, very clear kind of processes of accountability. And it's not just because I occupy what the university deems as marginalized that I can't also reproduce harm. And so I'm constantly having to think to myself, how do I, in my role and the things that we do, continue to hold ourselves to those practices, those ethics that brought us to this conversation around building community in the most authentic ways. So thank you all. And we have time for maybe like a couple questions. And so if anybody has questions, we would love to entertain them. So thank you very much. Yes. Mm. I'll offer this. Several years ago, so my formal training is in education, but it's in critical race theory. So, I always think I'm apparently banned in 26 states. So I think about that, right? Like what it means to do this work. And I remember one of our, I think, top scholars in critical race theory and education is Gloria Ladson-Billings, who, by the way, was on 60 Minutes. I didn't even realize that was like 2 nights ago. Anyway, but Gloria Ladson-Billings gave this, she gives these powerful lectures at one of our conferences, and we all go to see her because she always has something profound to say. And every single conference that I've seen her present, the one question she gets at the very end, it's kind of like, in some ways along the same vein. It's like, what can I do, right? What has to be abolished? And there's a movement right now around abolition in particular in critical race theory that another panel, another topic, would love to talk to you more about. Like what has to be abolished, but in that sense of abolition, what then has to be simultaneously be created? So it's not just about tearing down, it's about building. But some folks will ask, what can we do? And usually, it tends to be somebody who occupies power in many different ways. And they'll say, like, particularly, what can I as a white person do? Or what can I as a man do? Or, And she's like, she always has to tell people, she's like, I don't know if you all know this, but I run with a lot of folks. Like, my community is super diverse. But the folks that I run with have to make a commitment. So if you're white, what are you doing to reject whiteness? What are you doing to dismantle white supremacy? What does that look like in your everyday? And I think for her, she's been very clear, like if you're gonna engage with critical race theorists, I need you to do that work. So that when you come in to build here, you have deconstructed those parts that continue to mediate who you are. And I know that's tough. I mean, I think a lot of times in the ways that I tell people I benefit from whiteness every day because of how I look, I have phenotypic capital. And I think about that plays a part in how I navigate the world and how people see me. And but I have to be constantly working at what does that look like for me, right? How do I constantly sort of think about how white supremacy continues to mediate me? And that's hard. I teach at a high school as well. I was teaching the last couple of years at Squalicum High School, and I tell students, like, teaching folks about like power is like teaching a fish that water exists. Like, you're always in it, and it's hard to see it. And so the reminder is like, what are those commitments to constantly deconstruct and constantly work to that? And it's not always easy. And I don't know how to do that outside of community, outside of trusting relationships that can help me sort of ask a different set of questions. But that for me becomes that. Gloria Ladson-Billings reminded us, like, I can roll with white people so long as you're willing to critique and reject whiteness.
Already things that we could start to unmake. But I think that there's a resistance because of a lack of questioning about whether something is tradition or an actual policy, whether it's tradition or an actual law. And I think that willingness to be able to engage in those questions, I think, is central to that unmaking. I think unmaking destruction sounds very scary to people, and I get it. But it's literally just like, for example, somewhere in the bippity-boppity boop of whatever our system is, my birth name is still there. And so Western has these beautiful things where my name shows up on ClassFinder and is in my email, but yet on my pay stub, still my legal name. And I'm not the only one on this campus. There are trans folks on this campus whose supervisors have to approve their pay stub with the very dehumanization of their birth names. And it's always met with apologies. There are beautiful people that work at this university who do offer apologies, but at the end of the day, it's a side. And I realize there's a cost and that there's resources, but that's a software fix. A lot of that is just tradition. Well, we've always done that this way. Sometimes it's just getting the right person who is willing to question that tradition to make that change. And so that's a destruction. That is, and again, it's a scary word. That's an unmaking. But I think it's also convincing people that that is dehumanizing. Or when students are advocating, because that's the other thing I'm thinking of, like, if we're going to think about what do we want to unmake, our students have been telling us Like, it's been a while that we have a collection of demands that I think we can point to. Anyway, I won't get into all of them, but like we have a long list of things that we can already start to unmake. But I think questioning the policy versus tradition, I think that's part of the unmaking here.
That we've talked about in some of our classes is which is what Vero and Longoria are offering, is centralizing whiteness, but I think also really being critical of our own positionality, which is also what Vero is talking about, and how we are enacting those practices in the classroom with curriculum, with content. What do we prioritize? What do we not prioritize? We are a college of developing teachers, right? And I do this developing because I struggle with the word development, but I think essentially for us, or for me, when we are in the classroom and we are in front of students, is really practicing what does that look like when we are in front, because there is that dynamic of power, right? When we are faculty and students, of what does it mean for us to deconstruct that dynamic of power where we and I learned this from Vero specifically, is how do we co-construct and build a community within a classroom space. For example, content, authors, curriculum, and so I think just in a practical way, I think that has been the process for me to understand of how to build community in a challenging space like Western. And I mean, to be honest, I don't even know if that's even possible within our lifetime. I think we can work towards it, but I don't know if we're going to ever get to a place, or I will ever be able to see what that looks like in reality.
That's the futurity, right? That's the future that I think it needs to also be part of our theories of change. That, and it's not like a thought exercise, right? It's what are we working toward too? I think thinking about the future is a really, really important piece of this.
I just want to sort of say that I think it's a really valuable and important question, right? Like what needs to be gotten rid of or what needs to be redeveloped. And it made me think right away of like social determinants of health and health development and community health and well-being. And so, you know, as we identified those cancerous elements in this body of community that we have, then how do we not just ameliorate and remediate, but really eradicate these cancer sources? And I'm using cancer as a metaphor. And how do we build up and enhance and increase our other social determinants of health? So lift up opportunities for health in a broad sense of what our community could be. And to what Longoria was saying, really, yeah, I mean, if we find out what is really policy and law, okay, that's one thing. So then we know there's an angle to change law and to change policy. If it's just tradition, there are other ways that we can go about trying to change tradition. And so I would say we should all grapple with that. Like if we experience something that we believe is like harmful and oh my gosh, this should not be allowed or permissible, this has got to be, you know, gotten rid of. Let's lean in together and build some community around that. And so I think humbly communicating our observations and our diagnoses of where we think some of the detriments are together, and then working collaboratively again to deal with them, whether it's to actually tear something down or build something up or to fix something. But I'm kind of done with tinkering, right? And so it's like, so if we can figure out how we can collaboratively engage, I actually think we have an opportunity. I just want to say, well, last thing I'll say is optimistic. I feel like well, I can speak for Woodring for sure. I feel like we're in the opportunity is here for us to ascend. A lot of work needs to be done, a lot of relationships need to be repaired, a lot of trust needs to be built, but at the core, we have an amazing opportunity. And I think that's true across the campus, the university, with students and all of the employees at the university. I'm just excited about us trying to harness some of the possibility. I do think we have a critical mass of folks who really care and who are committed and who can do this stuff and who are brilliant, and that together we're going to really make some improvements.
I think with that, we're going to end because I think we're at time. I'll stick around a little bit if folks